Good evening. Welcome. We want to honor your time and get started promptly. Speak loud. All right. I will not only speak loud, I'll walk out into the middle of the hubbub. Sometimes I'm getting coached here by my friends from the home team. Thank you. We are delighted to have you here this evening. I am Craig French. I'm part of the organizing group for tonight. We have failed at our first decision, which was a big debate over how many programs to print. And you made us lose. Thank you. It's on, but I need to talk directly into it a little bit better, Gene. Thank you. So yes, if you have an extra program and you want to share it to somebody around you who does not have one, look at that. What a great spirit already. All right, while you're passing those, I want to read a quote from the young Swedish environmental activist Greta Thunberg, who in speaking to the world said this: "I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic and act as if the house is on fire." I think those words apply not only to her preferred issue, but to the reason why we are here tonight. And we do gather largely as people of faith, so I'm going to invite you to pray with me just for a moment. O God, who goes by many names and is called on in many tongues, we ask you to set this house and our hearts on fire. May it be the fire that cleanses, the fire that brings light, the fire that draws us closer to each other, and the fire that pushes us out in your name and in your Holy Spirit. Amen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Peter Sarver from St. Lucy's, part of the organizing committee, and I also want to welcome you here. I know there are Episcopalians in the house, and Presbyterians, and Methodists, UCC folks, Catholics, and Congregation Beth Shalom Shever Shaz. So we have a true interfaith group of folks here who are going to hear a message from Dr. Greg Carey, a very important message. I want to thank Pebble Hill Presbyterian Church for providing hospitality for us. I want to acknowledge the fact that if you need a bathroom, it's through that way and to the left. We hope this is an engaging evening for you. And without further ado, I don't know where we've hid Greg Carey. Oh, there you are. Okay. You know, the orange program has his bio, so I'm going to let you read his bio, which is very important. And of course, if you didn't pick up a bibliography also for the many sources of information that support the kinds of thoughts he's going to be sharing with us, please do that as well. So welcome. You were here a year ago, and you so impressed our group that we said we have to have this guy back because we've got some critical elections this November.
Thank you, Peter. I'm wired, so. Thank you all. It is wonderful to see all of you. When I've been talking about this issue for a couple of years now, and of course public interest has increased, I've started suggesting when invitations come, why not get a group of organizations together rather than just one? And that helps all of us. So I want to thank Peter and Craig and the organizing committee. I also want to thank Pebble Hill, and I want to thank Joanne, who asked me what I wanted on my pizza. But it helps also not just to be able to have more people in the room, it helps to see each other. It helps to be embodied together. The last presentation I did, one person said, "I was afraid I was the only one around here who cared." And I think a lot of people do care but don't know where to talk. So let me just say a little bit about what to expect. There are slides. I do use them. I don't encourage you to get locked into them. They are really there. If you're like me and you hear someone talk at you for an hour, you check out and check back in. Slides help you know where you are on the map. So, because the presentation does move kind of fast. I also want to share, I am not an expert on Christian nationalism. I am a New Testament scholar. I teach in a seminary. I'm a part-time pastor. I have been tracking this movement pretty actively for quite a while now, and word about the bibliography came out. The last slide will be a QR code. I'll leave it up if anybody wants it, and then you can have the link to the bibliography from that. And then finally, when I do this presentation, I ask for 60 minutes plus 30 for discussion, and I try to keep to that. I'm just noting that we started a little late. I'm not apologizing, just letting you know how to calibrate your watches with that. We didn't start a lot late. So what to expect other than me talking and then us talking together? We try to set out what Christian nationalism is, what it means, where it comes from in our history, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about that and controversy. And then we'll get deep into how it works and what it's doing. How it works is largely social psychology. What do people begin to believe when they identify with that movement, or what do they believe that makes it likely for them to? And what's it doing is a little more political. And then finally, I'm working from a Christian perspective. I realize not everyone in the room is likely to be Christian. And sometimes I do presentations for political groups. And I do offer some how to respond suggestions that you can interpret Christianly or otherwise. I'll just say there's no dodging with this topic. I'm not uncomfortable talking about political issues in a church space. I am uncomfortable talking about things that are partisan in a church space. And there is no dodging that there's a partisan dimension to the conversation. So let me say this. People who know me know I'm pretty politically liberal, pretty predictable about it. But right now, the people I am treasuring and reaching out to and strengthening my friendships with are political conservatives who love democracy. They are wonderfully valuable now, and many of them are frustrated and looking for a way forward. And so I do not want to come off doing some sort of partisan thing, because that's not where my heart is and it's not what I mean. But I do mean to talk about democracy. So what is Christian nationalism? Recently, Ralph Reed, who is a Christian nationalist, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying, "Oh, they made up this term just to attack us." I would invite anyone to search Google Scholar for the term Christian nationalism to see that term has been an object of study for decades. Decades. It's not new, it's not made up, it's fairly simple to describe. A Christian nationalist is someone who believes that the United States has a special relationship with God. That is, that God has specially chosen and blessed the United States, and in return expects the United States to respond by honoring God, by living according to a certain set of beliefs that are considered to come from God. Christian nationalists want the United States to say that it has a Christian identity. Back in the 50s, that happened when we put "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance and "in God we trust" over all our currency. That was Christian nationalism in the 1950s. That Christian nationalists believe that the United States should govern itself according to a specific interpretation of Christian principles. And that is the tricky one. All of these, to me, are problematic. But that one is tricky because if you listen to Christian nationalists who are prominent nationally, they all have the same political agenda. But if you read the social teachings of, let's say, Roman Catholics, or Black Protestants, or Orthodox, or the United Church of Christ, or Unitarians, or Lutherans, or Southern Baptists, even the Presbyterian Church USA and the Presbyterian Church of America, Christians don't agree on the most pressing social issues of the day: immigration, education, labor, women's rights, gender, sexuality, democracy, militarism, right? We're all over the place on these subjects. So who gets to decide who the Christians are, even if we were going to let Christians decide? And so my second definition is less scholarly, but in some ways more accurate. Christian nationalism is a very white phenomenon, even though not all Christian nationalists are white. We'll talk about what that means and why that's the case. And white Christian nationalism is an attempt to baptize a narrow political agenda, something that a majority of Americans does not support whenever they're asked about those issues, but call it the Christian view. It's an attempt to use Christianity as political leverage for that agenda. The way I like to think about it is, if someone tells me they believe Jesus is king, which is prominent language in Christian nationalist circles, and then they say they're the ones who speak for Jesus, then I have a good reason to suspect they do not support democracy. They might use democracy, and they talk about using democracy, but they might not support democracy because they want the world ruled according to their specific agenda, which they call Christian. Where might you be seeing it in the news? A lot of contemporary anti-LGBT activism and policies, especially around trans children and trans adults, but trans children and their education. Attacks on wokeness, critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in every level of society are buttressed by white Christian nationalism. Claims to parental rights, movements like Moms for Liberty, attempts to divert public funds to private schools, or anything meant to weaken public schools. A lot of chaos in where I live, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. A lot of activity in the public school boards trying to sort of create chaos for administrators, teachers, librarians. When you hear the language of religious liberty, which is a concept that I treasure, but religious liberty is an opportunity, for example, oh, I'm a landlord, but I don't have to lease a housing unit to an LGBT couple or household or individual, and saying that's because I'm a Christian, right? The liberty to discriminate, the liberty to not wear a mask when there's a mask mandate or not get a vaccine. If you work in a hospital and say it's for Christian reasons. Attempts to put Christianity in the public square, prayers, monuments, official language, complaining about the so-called war on Christmas, right? Christian nationalism. Retellings of history to argue that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and always has been a Christian nation, funded by tens upon tens, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars, with traveling representatives and so forth. Those are the issues that are in the news where you say, oh, I think Christian nationalism is here. What does it look like? Like, could I give you a picture of what Christian nationalism looks like? So, apparently that was therapeutic for someone. But let's set the moment, because I mean this in a serious way, analytically, right? This moment is the summer of 2020. Black Lives Matter demonstrations are happening. Sometimes there's violence around those protests. It's a nonviolent movement, but whenever there are protests, sometimes there are violent attacks on the movement. And the protests were happening in Washington. Then President Donald Trump opposed the protests, wanted them stopped. We now know, asked the Secretary of Defense, can't we shoot them in the legs? He's written about it. So he makes a speech in the Rose Garden of the White House, and then with a delegation proceeds, marches, clears a path with police force, clears out protest, and stands in front of St. John's Episcopal Church near the White House. You see that there are boards on the windows. I mean, it is a tough time. And he does not make a speech there, but instead he stands and holds up a Bible. Why do I interpret this as in terms of white Christian nationalism, the way I've just defined it? Because he's using Christian symbols as props for his political authority in a moment of conflict. Why do I say using them as props? Why am I so suspicious and I don't think it's sincere? Well, nobody called the Bishop of Washington to say, could this happen? And the next day a reporter thought to ask, and the bishop said, nobody called us. We would have said no. He wasn't welcome to use our church in this way. The Bible was not his Bible. Although he was in his 4th year in the White House, he did not have a Bible in the White House. They collected Bibles on a table, and he tried them out to see which was more Bible-y for a photo op, right? So that's what I mean by props. And I hope some of you are thinking, but you didn't say the thing. The thing is, this is white political authority, right? It's a specific reaction to the moment of the Black Lives Matter protests. Which continues to drive people nuts, right, in the Christian nationalist world. The use of Christian symbols to leverage political authority is the heart of how white Christian nationalism works. A little bit of a historical review. If you ask the question, I'm going to skip that. Wait, I am moving in the wrong direction. That's what's going on. Excuse me. I've got my pointer upside down. Where it comes from, some people say America is not a Christian nation. Some people say America has always been a Christian nation. If you ask a serious academic historian like John Thea, who teaches at Messiah College and wrote a book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? A fair historical answer is, it's complicated. Right? You could ask, for example, about individual colonies, Massachusetts Bay. Well, that was founded to be a Christian commonwealth. What about Rhode Island? Well, the people in Massachusetts Bay were running away from the Church of England. The people in Rhode Island had to run away from the people in Massachusetts Bay. What about Pennsylvania? Well, Quakers and Amish and Mennonites and Church of the Brethren and all kinds of religious mutts in Pennsylvania. Maryland, heavily Catholic. Southern colonies, heavily Anglican, not that anybody cared. That's not what motivated them to come, right? And so you do have diverse colonies, diverse points of view. One evangelical scholar, and I like to quote evangelical scholars about this because they have so much at stake, right? Their movement has been stolen from them. And Warren Throckmorton says, when you think about it, every one of the delegates who came to the Constitutional Convention knew that most colonies had established churches. And they chose to build a nation that did not have an established church. And the reason is they knew that in Europe, over 100 million people had been killed in religious wars in the 2 centuries previous. And probably tens of millions just in Britain in the 17th century. And they wanted a constitution that would allow people to live together without religion being the pretext for a war. So it's complicated. And various people, Abraham Lincoln, not a believing Christian, talked about God and providence all the time. Martin Luther King Jr., very much a believing Christian, relied heavily on calling the United States a Christian nation or a Judeo-Christian nation. Billy Graham, super influential in my world growing up, definitely committed to a view of Christian nationalism. There's a new book coming out by Brian Kaler and Bo Underwood. Mainline churches, Lutherans, United Church of Christ, Presbyterians were all on board with Christian nationalist initiatives in the 1940s and 50s. And so it's been there. It's been there for a long time. When we think about Christian nationalism as a movement now, this is my experience. A lot of us have an outdated notion of what's up. A lot of us think about people like Jerry Falwell and Jerry Falwell Jr., or Ralph Reed, or Pat Robertson, maybe Phyllis Schlafly if you go back a little bit. You're thinking about people from recognized churches, usually men, almost all white, almost all of the men wearing sort of a gray suit and a white shirt and a boring tie. A certain kind of respectable, denominationally recognizable Christian nationalism. That is still there and still very powerful. But there is one Christian movement in the United States that is growing today and is really the driving force of Christian nationalism. By the way, there are Roman Catholic Christian nationalists. The movement is called Catholic integralism. But how many of you have heard of the movement New Apostolic Reformation? That's a high percentage among groups I speak to. You need to know. You need to know. The New Apostolic Reformation is about 35 years old. It's a movement on the edges of Pentecostal charismatic Christianity. Belief that God is acting in dramatic, powerful ways, healing, working miracles, giving people spiritual gifts like the gift of prophecy or speaking in tongues. Now, the Pentecostal charismatic movement is huge. This is part of that movement. What makes the New Apostolic Reformation distinctive is that its leadership is not denominational, but it's networks of people who are identified as prophets and apostles. In other words, they claim that they speak directly for God. I'm doing a little research project on their preaching. They quote a lot of Bible, but they're not talking about the Bible. They're generally talking about the revelations they've had and the things they're watching God do and what they declare that God is doing. This movement is large. It is globally influential. If you think of Kill the Gay bills in Uganda and Ghana, think about them and their influence. It is large in Brazil, very big supporting Bolsonaro. And so you need to be aware of this movement. When you've seen those big Reawakening America tour events that reporters treat as if it's the craziest thing they ever saw, New Apostolic Reformation all over it. And the thing about that movement that is extremely important, that it shares with all forms of Christian nationalism, but is distinctive in this movement, is a belief in dominionism. The idea that Christians are called to take dominion over nations, over societies. And their language for it is taking dominion over the 7 mountains of culture. Business, government, faith, religion, family, religion, media, education, entertainment. I had to read it. 12 years ago in Lancaster, one of my best friends from home, we were very close. He played quarterback, I played center. We didn't run the shotgun, we were close. Thank you. He helped me move into my apartment in seminary, in each other's weddings. Told me he was coming to Lancaster for a religious convention, and I went to the convention center. Lancaster County has a population of about 650,000, so it's not like a small town environment, but 5,000 people in Lancaster for a religious event that's a mile from my campus at a theological school, and I don't know about it. And I heard a preacher I will mention later named Cheon, who is a Korean-American pastor in Pasadena, talked about the 7 mountains of culture. And I filed it. That was the first time I'd heard of the movement. I began paying attention, and you really should too. One place you have seen it, if you think of those pictures of Donald Trump with a circle of preachers reaching their hands out to him, almost all of them are out of that movement. Almost all. You also need to know that on December 29th, 2020, 8 days before the Capitol insurrection, 7 days before the rally at the Capitol that was planned by New Apostolic Reformation preachers, 12 to 15 New Apostolic Reformation prophets and apostles were in the White House for 2 hours. And they were not supposed to talk about it, but a couple did. And they said, we were there for a couple hours of praying and strategizing. It was amazing. On January the 6th, 2021, 6 protest permits were issued in that area around the Capitol. 4 went to New Apostolic Reformation figures. This is why you need to know about them. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, even though he's a Southern Baptist, has very heavy ties to that movement and calls one of those apostles his mentor. Cheon, the guy I heard in 2012, the day before the January 6th insurrection, outside the Capitol said, and I don't use sound because I'm always afraid it won't travel well. I played this once in a church and people complained that it was too scary. He said, I believe that this week we're going to throw Jezebel out. They believe in spiritual warfare and literally that there's a spirit named Jezebel, like the biblical Jezebel. No misogyny in it, of course, right? And that Jezebel is a demon who controls levers of government and power. We're going to throw Jezebel out, and Jehu, the Israelite king who killed Jezebel, is going to rise up, and we're going to rule and reign through President Trump and under the lordship of Jesus Christ. It's a much longer address than that. But understand, the idea is Christians ruling and reigning through a specific political network. And this is, of course, protesting the election. How does the movement work? A little bit of a sociologist, social psychology kind of question. What kinds of attitudes do we find among people who affirm the basic hopes of Christian nationalists? A sociologist I very much admire is Robert Jones of the Public Religion Research Institute. You can follow him and them on social media. And Jones, in his book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which is one of the best books I've read in the last 5 years, by a long way. Jones writes, one of the most remarkable, consistent findings in contemporary public opinion data is a chasm between 2 groups who otherwise share both geographic proximity and a common evangelical religious tradition. Let me say that in non-academic speech. 2 groups live close together and believe theologically pretty much the same things. Black Protestants and white evangelicals. Very similar theologies. Could not be farther apart in terms of their attitudes on key social issues. In fact, Jones demonstrates chart after chart that white evangelicals, when you divide Americans up by religion, are the group that's farthest apart on many issues from black Protestants. Oh, you might say, I'm Catholic, I'm not one. You're right out there too if you're white. Or you might say, well, I'm Episcopalian or Lutheran or next. Way out there. The one religious group that's closest to black Protestants in social attitudes is people who have no religious affiliation. So that Jones puts it in a way, I'll say it my way, which is nicer, not that I disagree with his. Jones says the more white people go to church, the more alienated they are from black Christians. What he really says, the more white people go to church, the more racist we become. What are these attitudes I'm talking about? Well, it shows up politically, right? So people who strongly identify as Christian nationalists. This is research by a couple of sociologists named Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry that they first published in Taking America Back for God 4 years ago, Christian nationalism in the United States. They took 6 survey questions that have been around for a long time. Baylor University has been doing national surveys for a long time. And these 6 questions had a 4-point scale of 4 is I strongly agree, right? And 0 is absolutely don't agree, and you can get 1, 2, 3, and 4 in between. People who, on those 6 questions, came out strongly with the Christian nationalist response scored 24, 6 times 4. People who strongly identified as Christian nationalists are more likely than other Americans to demand respect for national symbols and traditions, Pledge of Allegiance, stand for the national anthem, the flag, right? More likely to be suspicious of racial and religious minorities, especially immigrants. One change we've seen in Lancaster County, we used to brag to the world that Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and this was true, was the most hospitable place in the country for bringing in refugees. But over the past 10 years, that has been really stressed, right? Suspicious of racial and religious minorities, especially immigrants. More likely than other Americans to attribute racial inequality to the shortcomings of minority groups rather than to structural features or historical features of discrimination. More likely to condone police violence and distrust racial inequality in the criminal justice system. Simple way to put it, more likely not to believe black people and other people of color when they describe what happens to them. More likely than other Americans to support restrictive voting measures. The last one is a little shocking, but it comes through really, this isn't the last one, but more likely than other Americans to believe that whites and Christians are the most persecuted groups in America. And where we're feeling it in local politics now, more likely than other Americans to oppose scientists and science education. This goes all the way back to wars over evolution versus creationism, right? But it played out, right? Climate change, COVID, the use of psychology and other social sciences, and I'm going to spend some time on being opposed to public education, wanting either to end it or control it. So let's talk about public education for a minute. This is where these things are showing up locally more than anywhere else. A Florida Presbyterian, not the kind of Presbyterians y'all are, different Presbyterians, named D. James Kennedy has said the modern public education system was begun in an effort to deliver children from the Christian religion. Believe me, that was news to me having grown up in Alabama where teachers would ask me where I go to church. David Barton, he claims to be a historian. He and his son and their organization Wall Builders do national tours promoting the idea that the founders of the country all had theological educations. They were all Christians. They wanted a Christian society. He wrote a book called The Jefferson Lie, saying scholars had misrepresented Thomas Jefferson. Evangelical scholars challenged the book for basically distorting the facts and making them up. And his evangelical publishing house retracted the book. Think about that. A book is so irresponsible that the publisher brings back the copies. So he reissued it. He's still well-funded. He's still all over the country, all on TV all the time. And he said, schools have become the enemy of the country. Florida and Texas have come up with bills to replace, if school districts choose to, replace school counselors with chaplains. Now, some of you may be chaplains, and I need to say, I know what a qualified credentialed chaplain is. That's a serious set of training and commitments. I don't think they're asking for that set of training and commitments, one thing. Second thing, chaplains, as wonderful as they are not trained in the way school counselors are. They don't know child development. They don't know family theory. They don't know community networks of support. They don't know developmental psychology. They don't know education, right? But it's a straightforward attempt to inject evangelism rather than family and child support into public schools. We have that in Pennsylvania in the legislature right now. Because there are organizations that send this legislation to state legislatures. Right? Another thing that you'll find among Christian nationalists is, how shall I put it? Attitudes that threaten democracy. One of the founders of the Christian right, a guy named Paul Weyrich, famously said, you could get video of this address, many of our Christians want everybody to vote. I'm sure you and I, because we're a pretty old group, by the way, I'm sure you and I were raised to think of voting as something we all should do and should encourage everybody to do. He said, I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down. If you think about it this way, if you're zealous for your cause, you're going to be more active than people who are less zealous. And if they can be demotivated from voting, then you get an advantage because you can count on yours. One initiative right now, this is the second question I'm going to ask. I ask these questions to help me. I learn from the feedback I get in these presentations. I change them all the time. How many of you are familiar with Project 2025? Okay, last time I did this was like 15%, and that was just a couple of weeks ago. It was less, this is 15 or 20%. Last time I did it was just a handful. The Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank, in partnership with dozens of other one of the biggest ideas is to reclassify many federal employees so that they can be fired at will and replaced by people who adhere to the political ideology. You can go on the Project 2025 website. If I had the time, I would read a list of the questions you have to answer if you want to serve in that administration. That will tell you a lot. But part of what you need to know is this project is heavily Christian nationalist. Among the organizations that support it, the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Family Association, the Center for Renewing America, the Family Research Council, the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute, Moms for Liberty. This is all on the website and in the document, y'all. Okay? One figure I want to talk about is a guy named Russ Vought. So, Political magazine ran this article, Trump allies prepare to infuse Christian nationalism in second administration. Russ Vought was the president of the Center for Renewing America. During the previous Trump administration, he was the director of the Office of Management and Budget. This is not a minor figure. You've never heard of him. He's not a minor figure. And in the manual, the roadmap, he wrote the chapter on the Executive Office of the President of the United States. It's chapter 2 in the document. He's a key figure. And he wrote an article, Is There Anything Actually Wrong with Christian Nationalism? In Newsweek, and tweeted, I'm proud to work with William Wolfe on scoping out a sound Christian nationalism. So you have this agenda very close to the center of power in the United States. This works at every level of government, from local to county to state to federal. And, it's more influential in some places than others, but it is well-funded, all of these organizations are well-funded, right, and well-structured. What about democracy and Christian nationalism? Well, on the screen, this is that Whitehead and Perry 24-point scale, right? 0 are people who really don't identify with Christian nationalist beliefs. 24 is here. And the question is, do you consider voting a privilege rather than a right? Folks who resist Christian nationalist ideas are highly unlikely to think of voting as anything other than a right. About 10% of them think voting is a privilege. Just over 50% agree that voting is a privilege rather than a right. Now, what does that mean pragmatically? If voting is a privilege, it can be taken away, right? I grew up in Alabama. I was born in 1965. I was a lot older than born, but way too old to know what had been done to keep black people from voting in Alabama, right? Taxes, impossible tests that no white person could pass either, not to mention outright violence. But there is a movement in the United States to say that voting is a privilege rather than a right. And it's behind so much legislation ever since the Shelby County decision in the Supreme Court. So much legislation that is targeted to make it harder for people who are poor to vote, harder for people of color to vote based on demographic characteristics, harder for college students to vote who tend to vote a certain way, harder for older people who no longer drive to vote, right? All of these things are targeted. If you ask a person who holds this point of view, well, don't you think those policies are exclusive or racist? They might argue with you, but the main thing is they legitimately will not understand why you're bothered by it. If you've had that conversation, I saw somebody nod. If you've had that conversation, they don't understand what's wrong with making voting harder. More on democracy. The percentage of Americans who say they think we might need political violence to save our country has been going up year by year for the past few years. This data that I have is from last year. It's Robert Jones again. Believe me, I do read people other than Jones and Whitehead and Perry. And this is a tough sentence to sort of parse, so I'll slow down. White Americans who agree that with this question, God intended America to be a promised land for European Christians. Think that through, right? You get Christian nationalism, God wanted America to be a promised land, and you get a special racism bonus. European Christians are 4 times as likely as those who disagree with it to agree with another one. True American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. As of 2023, according to Jones data, 43% thought that violence might be necessary to save the country. A religion scholar at the University of San Francisco named Brad Onishi, who has a podcast, Straight White American Jesus, tongue-in-cheek, but Brad is a former evangelical, and he wrote a book called Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. It came out last year. I'll tell you, when I started reading it, I didn't think it was very good. I didn't like it. By the time I was finished, I thought, this is the most important book I read this year on the subject. Onishi says, if my evangelical self from the 90s, he's younger than I am, if I was still in that movement now, would I have been in Washington, D.C. marching on the Capitol on January 6th? And his answer to himself was probably so. Because the language of the movement is so infused with language like spiritual warfare, enemies, devil, demons. Last year I was invited by a local Christian nationalist group to participate in a debate with some professional debater they were bringing in to talk about the Bible and LGBT issues. I'm for inclusion and full dignity. And I thought about it. My first thought was, nobody asks you to do that unless you're being set up. But I also thought, well, if just somebody goes and is reasonable and voices a principled Christian argument for inclusion and dignity, maybe somebody just needs to hear that night. Maybe it's worth it. And then I asked some people who are way higher on the academic food chain than I am, who had debated this guy, should I do it? And the one who gave the first reply said, absolutely not, you won't believe what he'll do. And this is true about debates, right? In a moment of a debate, you can just lie. You can make up data, and nobody can possibly refute it because they can't, you never know how somebody might lie, right? But besides that, I learned what they do is they take the debate and then they chop up the video. And it goes out in a bunch of different YouTube sites and a bunch of, Instagram and TikTok and Twitter about how this liberal theologian got crushed by this great debater. I realized, I would just be like fueling this. I'm not going to do it. They found somebody, but they didn't tell me what the conference was called. This is Lancaster County, home to me. The Gospel at War. And notice the cross in the advertisement. A sword, right? A cross sword. This is what I mean. Just a few months ago, wrong clicker. You can do it, Greg. Charlie Kirk. How many of you heard of Charlie Kirk? Founder of a movement called Turning Point USA, had an office at Liberty University. A think tank there, has this podcast where he and his bros are talking, and they argue that the people involved in prosecutions of Donald Trump should be publicly executed, and that children should be made to watch. And then, being the kind of guys they are, they go on to talk about, well, what's the best way to do it? And for a little while they bounce around, well, the French had the guillotine and settled on hanging. Now, you might be thinking, well, this is on the fringe. These things are all on the fringe. Look up the social media followers of Cheon and Charlie Kirk and anybody else you know who's not Taylor Swift, and you tell me the use of violence was very real on January the 6th. But what you might not think about is how real it is now. We had a drag queen story hour that was supported and was going to happen at the Lancaster Public Library, and a bomb threat came in, a suspicious package was found that turned out to be a real package. But anyway, I just learned the other night from, I won't say who, and you'll understand why when I explain why. People are still getting death threats. And when you get death threats, most death threats don't obviously come through, right? But that is political violence, because eventually someone will do it or try it. And we have had a judge in a Donald Trump case. Someone came to their house and killed their child when he opened the door. Right? I'm not trying to be alarmist. I'm not trying to say it is rampant. I am trying to say that if you ask the FBI what the number one risk of terrorism in the United States is, it is right-wing political violence without a close competitor, and has been for a long time. There is, let me check my time. Oh, great. There is an international dimension to this movement. Religious nationalism, if you track it, and paired with deteriorations in democracy, Brazil, Bolsonaro, India, Modi, Israel, Netanyahu, Turkey, Erdogan. Vladimir Putin makes a big deal of Russia as a Christian nation. To my understanding, 9% of Russians go to church. But part of the war on Ukraine is a split in the Orthodox Church. So the bishop of the patriarch of the Russian church blesses the war. Viktor Orban in Hungary. And last year I had the opportunity to visit Hungary and visit with some democracy activists there. You may not realize how much Viktor Orban has been promoted in the right-wing press in the United States over the past few years. Especially since Putin has invaded Ukraine, and you can't sell that, but you can sell Orban, who is the most prominent supporter of Russia in the European Union. Last year, the Conservative Political Action Committee held its meeting, not in the United States. For the first time, they went to Budapest. And then later, when they met in Dallas, Orban was the keynote speaker. Jim Garlow, an apostle, the person Mike Johnson says is his spiritual mentor, said Orban may be one of the best leaders in the world, probably the most biblically grounded. And did you know that earlier this year, Orban made a visit to Mar-a-Lago? And Donald Trump had this to say about it, except I turned the page too early. He's a very great leader, a very strong man. Strong man means dictator. The European Union has declared Hungary no longer completely free. Some people don't like him because he's too strong. It's nice having a strong man running your country. Viktor Orban, he's one of the strong, hear how many times the word strong? One of the strongest leaders in the world. He's the leader of Turkey. Now, I know that was fun, but also, besides being fun, it makes the point, right? These political leaders all support one another internationally. You will rarely see conflict among them out loud. So the slide from Turkey to Hungary is not that big a jump in that network of associations. I want to say a few specifically Christian things about Christian nationalism, and then close my remarks by offering some advice about how to respond. Simply, I think Christian nationalism is dangerous for the gospel. I have people, smart people, say, don't call it Christian nationalism, it's not Christian. It's Christian. Christians have done every horrible thing under the book and every good thing, right? Christianity has fueled blessings and curses. I'm a Christian, I'm passionate about it. But these are people who, many of them I don't doubt love Jesus. Some I think are pretty darn cynical. But ordinarily, these are people who are trying to be faithful to Jesus. But they're doing it, as many Christians have done in our nation's history, in ways that are very dangerous. Christian nationalism is idolatrous. The very thought that one country would be God's favorite and that it would just happen to be yours, and that one political party represents on every issue, Right? How is it that immigration is a partisan issue? It's a tough issue. We should disagree about immigration. How come you have to line up on sides over an issue like immigration? It's idolatrous to say God blesses just one country and one point of view with this particular thing. I'm telling you this on the basis of having listened to a lot of the preaching. Christian nationalist preachers use Jesus as a brand. What do I mean by that? They talk about Jesus. They don't talk about the things he did and said. Parable of the Good Samaritan, rich man and Lazarus. Blessed are the peacekeepers. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Love your enemy. Turn the other cheek. Do your praying in private. Those are things Jesus said. Right? They rarely touch the things Jesus did and said. Fed everybody. Even fed Judas. That's what I mean by reducing Jesus to a brand. And I've been analyzing these sermons, literally charting the scripture references that are quoted. Jesus is about love, they're about dominion. And you will hear about dominion and authority all the time. The understanding of freedom that we receive from Jesus and from Paul is about freedom from sin, freedom to serve each other. It is not freedom to exclude people from social benefits. It's not the freedom not to serve someone in your business because of their race or their beliefs or their sexual orientation or gender expression. It's dangerous for the gospel because they have convinced a lot of people outside the church that they speak for all of us. Number one reason younger people say they don't go to church, because of Christians. And the last reason I think they're dangerous to the gospel is they, and I mean this sincerely based on hearing them, they don't take sinfulness seriously. And you'll think, what? They're all about everybody else's sinfulness. Well, that's the problem. They think that if you put Christians in charge, you'll get good government. Now, we Christians have been trying that for 2,000 years. Right? We are as prone to sin as anyone else. And we do not have a monopoly on righteousness or insight. And yet they say, trust us. We'll do it right. How do I recommend you respond? The first thing, which I'm going to undermine in every other thing I say, is guard your soul. And here's what I mean. We are, as a society, not just you and me, but generally speaking, people are angry, resentful, and suspicious. Used to be, if you ask parents, do you care if your child marries someone of the other political party? Almost all of them said, I don't care. Now everybody cares. Parents won't speak to their children. Children can't figure out what's wrong with their parents. Workplace harassment. My wife's an employment lawyer. We're doing great. Seriously. Guard your soul. Whatever the spiritual practices that you pursue are, and this applies if you're not Christian, because there are a lot of ways to be spiritual. Whatever they are that keep your soul soft and pliable and merciful and kind and patient. If it's walking in the woods, if it's petting your dog, if it's riding your horse, if it's meditating, praying, taking Mass every day, if it's being around kids and grandkids or elderly persons or persons who are disabled in ways they need help, guard your soul. Do not become bitter or angry. I have an angry streak. When it happens, people will tell me, and I think how did they know? It is not helpful to anybody. And you won't live as long. You'll have health problems. Guard your soul. On the flip side, stay alert. A lot of us have our little news sources, but really in particular, if there's local news, dig into the local news. Nobody reads the local paper anymore. Gotta, because that's where important things that change people's lives are happening. Be vigilant. Stay in touch. Find people who are doing important work and follow them and see what they're saying. Read. Do whatever you can to be in touch with things that are going on. This is not, democracy is at stake. And it is not obvious how it will go. Organize. Organize. Most political donations in the United States come from 50 families. 70%, 69% go to one party. Organize. Does that mean signing up for a political group, whether it's partisan or not? Does it mean knocking on doors? Does it mean giving money? Does it mean making phone calls? Does it mean making cookies? Organize. Does it mean going to the Capitol? Does it mean running for office? Does it mean encouraging people to run for office? Does it mean support them? Organize. This event had sign-up table. Organize. Organize. The only way to overcome the amount of money and energy that's being spent to end democracy is for people who love democracy to organize. I don't know if you've ever heard of Alan Bozak, South African apartheid pastor theologian. I had the chance to briefly meet him, and he had said, you can't just volunteer for justice. And I try not to tell stories that are flattering of me, but I said something smart to him. When he said it, I thought, and people who want to do evil work overtime. And I shared that with him. I just want to say he co-signed. Organize. Treat people as people. Now, before I get into this, I'm going to give the exception. Some people get into conversations with you about theology, religion, politics, gender, sexuality, and they are abusive to you. You have a right to walk away or tell them to stop. Sometimes you need to get between someone and someone they're abusing. Do it. But to the degree that it's possible, treat them as people and not as enemies. I'm thinking of a conversation I had with someone I actually love who was driving me nuts at a party. And I said, I just don't have time for this. And walked away. And they came back and started again. I said, I need to tell you something. I love you. But this is not fun for me. And I'm not going to put up with it. And their feelings were hurt. And now we have a better relationship. But I didn't go off on it like I have once. Treat people like people. Don't objectify them. And then finally, my background is Southern Baptist. I was a high school convert. Though I think black Christians do it better. Testify. How many of you know what testimony means for evangelicals or black church? You'll have whole services where all you do is sing and pray and people will stand up and testify. And testify means they will just share what God has done in their lives, either their whole life or most recently. They testify, they share it. And I'm not asking you to do exactly that, but this is what I mean. The chances that you're going to be in a political conversation and say something so smart that someone who is deeply entrenched and disagrees with you is going to say, you know, I've been wrong. It happens. It is extremely rare. But you do have influence. And the way to do it is not to argue, but testify. What do I mean? I want to give you homework. Go home. Write down 5 things you really care about. I've got a grandson. I want to live in a society, and he goes to a great public school system. I want to live in a society where every child has an opportunity to get the same quality of education he gets, regardless of their school district. I want to live in a society where everyone receives dignity and has an opportunity to contribute in our political process. I want to live in a society where we realize that we can do great things together and we don't have to be pitted against each other. Now, those are values, but these are things I want. I want to live in a society where kids can go to school and people can go to work without being harassed or belittled. And this is a society I want to live in. And when you testify, you have the chance to give someone something to chew on without arguing. They might argue back. Well, yeah, but that's not the kind of society I want to live in. I don't want to live in a society. I have an op-ed I'm waiting to be published in the local paper. I think she forgot about it. I don't want to live in a society where one religious group gets to decide what the religious influences are for everybody else. That's religious freedom to me. I recommend testifying. So I want to thank you for the amount of time you've already just about right. And I know there are microphones. If you have comments or questions, let me just say something while that's happening. If you would like to offer a comment or question, let me just say this. It's not the time to make a long statement. And please, if you have a question, focus it. If someone's going on, I'll say something like, let's bring it home. So. This is that time. There is a microphone if you have something you'd like to follow up on, if I wasn't clear. Yes. And I won't try to draw it out. My ego doesn't need it. I see you got the fans going, hey, I'm wearing a jacket. Yes, right here.
Can you speak about
Can I speak about white flight?
Oh, can you please speak about right flight? Brad O'Neill.
Long I can talk about white flight. You know why? I've lived in Memphis. Let me explain what I mean. When integration happened all over the country, many white people left their cities for suburbs and exurbs or moved their children out of the public school system into private schools. There are states now that are more segregated than they were in 1960. This data is outdated. Alabama public schools are more segregated than they were when I went to high school, which would be the early 80s. Nobody is going to accept it if you say that's racist, but that's racist. And the effect that it has, of course, is to empty the tax support for the place that's just been abandoned, which has greater burdens because all the public buildings are there, right? And you get places that are just devastated. Churches have done white flight in many cases, relocated out of a city to suburbs. So is that, your hand is up, that might not be what you mean. Oh, explain to me, right of flight.
He talks about conservative Christians moving to such states like Montana, Oregon, the eastern part of Oregon,
Yes.
Idaho, because they want to live in a state
sorry.
and parts of the country where they have the same values. Can you speak about that, please?
More briefly than white flight, but yes, I can. This is a thing, and let me just say this. One of our biggest political problems is political flight in general. Those of us who tend to vote liberal progressive keep gravitating toward the coast and the cities, and people who tend to be more conservative keep moving, like people leaving California for Texas. But there is, especially in the Northwest, an area that some are calling the American Redoubt, where groups of aligned white people and often white Christians are trying to build sort of an enclave of aligned people. I've worked with a political organizer in Idaho who says you just wouldn't believe what you'll hear state legislatures later say. Generally armed, generally prepared to resist federal government. We've seen with like the Bundy cases. And to just make a point about political violence in that movement, thank you for being willing to correct me, by the way. No, you weren't. I'm coachable, though. But to get to the point, when those Bundy events were happening, don't you remember that certain news outlets were glorifying that? So this cult of violence and cult of militia, which is very heavy in that movement, but that is a national thing. And it has been being promoted for a lot longer than we like to imagine. Yes?
I have two brief comments. One is a statistical phenomenon about voting. It doesn't take a majority to win an election. It only takes a 20% committed voting bloc. And I can lead anyone here, everyone here, through the mathematical steps to demonstrate that fact. To neutralize that bloc, okay, and I should first define the bloc. The bloc is a group of people who are committed to voting. They will vote, and will vote for a particular candidate. It only takes a 20% block of that kind to win the election, to win an election. Okay, and that a statistical analysis will show that. To neutralize the block, you need to get to a turnout of, among all eligible voters, registered or not, of about 72 to 74%. So you really need to get a big turnout. That seldom happens even in a national or state.
This is your first
election.
point, and it's very helpful.
Last
Your
point.
second is?
And the second point is a quote, and it refers to a demographic that you haven't mentioned, except a little bit implicitly. Here's the quote. "This is a Protestant country, and everyone else is here at our sufferance." You know, who said everyone else is here at our sufferance? And here's the person who said that, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay, and that attitude remains alive in his demographic.
Yes.
And that has a huge influence through their wealth on
Thank
everything that happens here in this country.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Theologically, Christian nationalism is an abomination. From a human point of view, it is inhumanity. Now, the problem is, how do you address these evils? I think of racism. We haven't fixed racism. And here, another problem is evolving, affecting the Christian faith. It's an abomination. Hopefully, Christians will learn how to act that way and reject this.
Thank you. We also have a question up front. I want to say, you said abomination. I agree. I said idolatry. And a couple of years ago, I think the author's name was Matthew Wolfe, wrote a book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. 4, right? And he argued that people naturally gather with their own kind. It took a long time. The book was getting all kinds of positive reviews from conservative Christians. It took a long time for people to realize that he has strong white supremacist background in his life, and that when he meant people like to be with people like them, he meant what they were saying when I was growing up about desegregating schools. The tie between Christian nationalism and racist attitudes, sociologists will tell you, is incredibly strong. Okay, back there and then up here, I guess, or up here. Yes.
I just wanted to remind people to vote in the school board elections coming up next week. Most of our campaign literature that comes in the mail does not specify a party, so you need to know who you're voting for.
Thank you.
Yeah, you had mentioned that most of these groups and organizations are well-funded, so that means there's people at the top and I'm sure some sort of hierarchy. I'm just wondering what you think about the people at the top, the people with the money. How much do they believe what they're espousing, and how much are they using it to convince other people for some other nefarious purpose?
There's a scholar named Matthew Taylor who, as far as I know, has done the best work, and his book is coming out this fall, on the New Apostolic Reformation movement. Most of us, if we watch those preachers, would think they are absolute criminals. We would think they're faking it, they don't mean it. He has interviewed many of them, and he is convinced that they really believe it. I don't think we can analyze in an effective way that line between true believers and manipulators. What I think we can analyze, though, is what are they doing? So you can analyze, are they lying? When I read the op-ed by Ralph Reed in Wall Street Journal, he was literally knowingly misrepresenting data because I'd seen the same data. Is he a true believer? Maybe he thinks, his job is to spin things in his favor. But remember that the people who are invading the Capitol, the people who are rallying at school board meetings, the people who are getting worked up about Drag Queen Story Hour, they may be very passionate, authentic in their belief, but that doesn't mean, here's how I would put it. Every few months, isn't it a different controversy? Right? Isn't it parental choice? Oh, isn't it the books in the library? Oh, isn't it critical race theory? Oh, isn't it trans kids in the bathroom? Oh, isn't it? Somebody's deciding what that agenda is and how to sell it. And that's where the funding comes in. Yes?
Can you speak about the separation of church and state and how that relates to all this?
Can I speak about the separation of church and state?
Okay. Did everybody hear my question?
Well, go ahead, please.
Okay. Can you speak about the separation of church and state and how that relates to all of this?
So, advocates of Christian nationalism will say that the separation of church and state is a made-up concept. You can find a clip of Lauren Boebert saying, oh, it showed up in a letter, after the Constitution was framed, but it's, we reject that idea, and they do. Those of us who support the separation of church and state, I would note a few things. What's in the Constitution? There is an establishment clause, right? There shall be no establishment of religion, which is to say the government is not to put its thumb on the scales for any sectarian movement. There's also a freedom of religion, freedom of practice clause, right? People are free to practice or not practice religion as they choose. I'll say one more thing in the Constitution, often overlooked, no religious test, right? In other words, for office holders, there shall be no religious test for their eligibility. Now, in right-wing circles right now, there are people saying there should be religious tests and there should be established religion. And they're willing to say we should be willing to do away with the Constitution. Some, not all. But the adherence to the Constitution that we used to hear has really been weakened on the right wing. And even to the point where, like the Claremont Institute, one of its founders, a guy named Anton, I believe, has argued that we need a Caesar who will come in and by force straighten things out. And of course that would, so the first thing I want to say is separation of church and state shows up in the Constitution in those three ways. The second thing I want to say, as someone who used to be Baptist, is Baptists and Quakers had a lot to do with that. And the reason is Baptists and Quakers had the experience of being persecuted by state churches. And they leaned heavily on Thomas Jefferson, who put it in the Virginia Constitution and then in the United States Constitution. And that about the Virginia Constitution is on his tombstone. So one thing you can say to a Christian nationalist is, it's Christians who wanted an inclusive, pluralistic society. I'm sorry, there's someone behind you, but we'll get to you.
Thank you for being here with us and for sharing. Can you talk about the role of patriarchy within in the worldview of Christian nationalism? How patriarchy plays a role there?
Yes. I have a slide I don't have time for now, that those slides of things Christian nationalists are more likely to believe. They're more likely to believe that women should not be in positions of public leadership or leadership in churches or leadership in households. Christian nationalism trends to be a patriarchal thing. Now that said, aren't we seeing a lot of women articulating Christian nationalism in the public sphere as elected officials? And so I don't want to overstate it. You know, until the 1970s, most mainline denominations, it was rare for a woman to be ordained as a pastor. Now, most candidates for ministry are women in these churches. But in reaction to that, in conservative evangelicalism, there was a dramatic pushback against it. So Southern Baptists, for example, it was rare for women to be ordained, and then they decided, and we're not going to have it, and made it a national position. That was in 2000. That's pretty recent. So reaction against women's progress, and I'll add, reaction against the progress of black people, predictably gets this kind of pushback. There was yes, you saw the person. Could you take the mic, please? Thank you. Craig, can I count on you to keep time and shut me up? Okay.
Are Christian nationalists and MAGA Republicans one and the same?
Are Christian nationalists and MAGA Republicans one and the same? No. No. Christian nationalists are almost always Trump supporters, but not always. And there are a lot of people who are MAGA Republicans who are not religious. I think it's fair to say, I mean, most political scientists would say this, that what holds the Republican Party together are people who want an economy that is not regulated. It's regulated as little as possible, which is not enough to win an election. And right-wing Christians, who are a big group, like that kind of bloc we were talking about a minute ago, but not nearly enough to win an election. And they agree to live together. And I think that's what we fundamentally have. That's an overgeneralization. Obviously, there are other groups, other movements, but that explains a big chunk of the movement.
There is a movement for a constitutional convention. Do you see this as a part of the rights movement to open the Constitution for their purposes?
I just learned about this movement to have a constitutional convention. As I understand it, when an academic tells you, as I understand it, that means they don't know much. Right? And by the way, if somebody claims to be an expert and doesn't tell you what they're not sure about, they're not an expert. So, as I understand it, the movement wants states to have the right to nullify federal laws. Which would, of course, again, as a child of the South, we did that a couple of times, right? And so it tracks heavily. Now, I remember when I first heard about it, hearing some of the people involved, there were people I recognized as Christian nationalists. There are states that have already signed on for this constitutional convention. They tend to be red states. I remember Georgia, I think, was first. I just told you everything I think I know. Is there more you'd like to say?
I think it's reaching the balance point. I think the state approval is reaching the point where it may become a reality.
If there's a constitutional convention, the other reason this is important is once there's a constitutional convention, that whole thing about 3/4 of the states or vast majorities of Congress, no, it's what the constitutional convention decides and then states ratify it. So that it is a serious, well-funded movement, and it is definitely a threat to democracy. I'm going to go in just a minute. There's a hand in back. And up front, so we'll get those two. Democracy is being attacked most directly at state levels, right? So, and it's working in states that are not just one point of view. Like Texas is a pretty even state, but democracy is being crushed in Texas. Tennessee is not as red as you think. Wisconsin. So watch for those things.
And let's be thinking about wrapping up with the next couple
two more.
of questions.
In the question that someone had up front about funding for this thing, I've read that it's the billionaires, people like, well, there's only one Koch brother left, but the Koch brothers and people like that, and they don't give a damn about any of this stuff. They just want be able to get more money. Isn't that what's happening? Want freedom to destroy the country.
I was reading about this today. This is just a reporter's point of view, so I'm not claiming that it's authoritative. But out of those 50 families that are giving that massive amount of money, and I think it's $1 billion so far this year, 69% are one political party. And the analyst argued what they're really voting for is to sustain and enhance their own wealth generationally. It makes sense to me, but I'm not an analyst of those things. Last comment, question?
So maybe you just answered it, but I have so much trouble with people attaching themselves to Trump, and because they're Christians, because he clearly isn't. So I've wondered, is it his racism that attracts them? Is it his hatred of immigrants? Or is it just the fact that he's running as a Republican and they want that economic position? Because they certainly can't really seriously think he's a Christian.
Thank you. Warning, this was the last comment or question. The answer is going to be long. And most of the answer is going to be well-founded in research. Those of us who identify as liberal can't understand why people would support Donald Trump. John Fia, evangelical historian I just mentioned, wrote a book. I think it was Why Trump? Why did the evangelicals, and he's a conservative evangelical. We like to think that we're operating in our minds. People do not operate in our minds. I don't, you don't. We operate out of our networks that we live in and the people we live around. And we operate out of our gut responses to things. And any social psychologist will tell you, and then we figure out how to justify it to ourselves. So I don't know that it's necessarily at that level of, on the other hand, what has Trump done for Christians? This is what he'll ask them. And he'll say some things. Look at the Supreme Court justices I got you. Look at how much I've done to remove the barriers to religious groups having influence on society. Look how hard I am on Muslims. Those are policies that resonate with some groups of Christians. They want Christianity acknowledged. They want the ability to live their faith even if it pinches other people. And they care a lot about abortion. I could add, abortion in the early 70s was not a conservative evangelical issue. Christianity Today ran a whole issue where it was being debated. Southern Baptists passed 2 resolutions supporting choice. That was a political move in the 70s to make abortion an evangelical issue. But I want to say one other, the follow-up. Students of democracy globally will say there are 2 things that can happen in a society that undermine democracy. One is radical economic inequality. This society is the most unequal it's been since the Great Depression. And a lot of people and regions of the country feel left out and feel resentment. I can tell you as an Alabamian that when I hear people say negative things about the South, I am likely to confront them. That feeling left out, feeling like your area is declining, feeling like there's no opportunity, makes people mad. Feeling like people are making fun of you makes people madder. The second thing, and this isn't pretty for those of us who like to be inclusive is rapid social change freaks people out. And that can be demographic, right? It can be immigration, which is why it plays so powerful. We need more immigrants. We also need policies that work, and neither party has a policy for immigration. So, but rapid demographic change freaks people out, and changes in culture, right? I'm thinking of someone in particular. I used this example in an earlier conversation today. Older gentleman, all his life is told dirty jokes at work. One day, a supervisor says, you know, we're getting complaints. You can't do that. Whatever. He's mad about it. Oh, now we can't be funny anymore. Now, I'm sure all his life there have been people who felt disempowered from being able to complain about it. But he doesn't know. So he keeps doing it. Loses his job. And he's mad about it. Political correctness. But I want you to think about it. I'm sympathetic not to his behavior. But what I'm saying is he experienced social change in ways that left him feeling demeaned. Was he demeaned? No. Right? But it felt that way. And so the kinds of changes that require people to act differently or speak differently or to be in uncomfortable, unfamiliar circumstances, people deeply resent it. And that's happening in the UK, in Canada, in the United States, in Brazil, in Hungary, in Poland, in Slovenia. All over where democracy is under threat, there's this wave of cultural resentment, and it tends to map onto, we think about states because TV tells us, no, urban, suburban, urban, rural. So the last thing I'll say before thank you, one of the biggest predictors of people's voting behavior, does their neighborhood have sidewalks? Right? Do you interact regularly with different kinds of people? So, over time, you have been wonderful. It's warm because we're all here. Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter, as well.
Once again, I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to thank Dr. Carey for bringing us to a whole new level of consciousness about how Christian nationalism is a threat to our democracy and to our Christian faith. So, really glad you were able to join us for this evening, and look for those emails coming from Interfaith Racial Equity, and hope you become involved in various kinds of activities in the future. Good night.